So we are here today to recognize 20 years of service towards peace, security, and international cooperation. And we have been able to do that thanks to the 46 members of our Federation Council and the generous financial support of the Swiss Confederation. We are also here to strengthen the spirit of friendship among our alumni and current participants, but also to look at past, current, and future challenges in global security. To start this conference, we have thought that it would be appropriate to begin with an organization that cares for the most vulnerable, the victims of armed conflict. The ICRC plays a crucial role in helping alleviate the suffering of people affected by armed conflict and other situations of violence. It's a great honor to have with us today the president of the ICRC, Dr. Peter Maurer. The beauty of social media is that now, day by day, we can follow the path of international actors. Mr. President, for your moving encounters last week with young girls in northern Nigeria, to the need to secure funding in Brussels at the beginning of the week, and the interview with Christine Anmanpour on CNN on Wednesday, you have had a very busy week. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please join me in welcoming the President of the ICRC, Mr. Peter Maurer.
Cher Christian, ladies and gentlemen, you have to bear with my voice this afternoon because one of the dire consequences of traveling too much and to being too much in planes is that I have lost my voice. But I'll do my best to be able to talk to you. Look, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the GCSP, its leadership, staff, and fellows on the substantial contribution to both the academic debate and training around security and peace policy for now 20 years. Given from where I'm speaking today, let me start with a very few personal remarks first. Security has been somewhat of a leitmotif throughout my life. For the past 20 years, and still now, I've been involved in operating, concretizing, developing concepts of security, all during a time where the notion of security and its purposes in policy and practice have not stopped growing. More than 20 years ago, as an official in the Foreign Office, I worked with defense and police ministries to adapt and strengthen national security policies in view of new challenges in the international environment. I witnessed an evolving landscape of risks and a shift of focus from defense of national territory by military means to managing more comprehensive economic, societal, technological, and environmental risks, as well as emerging security challenges like cybercrime and new forms of terrorism. 15 years ago, I was made head of a newly created Human Security Division in the Swiss Foreign Ministry. The concept and practice of human security we developed from there introduced the instruments of soft power to the traditional toolbox of national security policies. Our focus was to protect individuals and societies from violence rather than states, borders, and institutions. This shift from structural to human came with a new interest in conflict mediation and transformation through non-military civilian tools. I then moved on to become the permanent representative of Switzerland, which had just joined the United Nations, and thereby became both a shareholder and operative in the global collective security system that states had created after the Second World War. In the midst of post-war, Cold War transformation, I witnessed the power shifts and tensions in the international relations. And today, as president of the ICRC since 2012, my first priority is to create a safe and secure space for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action in an increasingly complex and conflictual environment, I should say. While I'm glad to be here with you to discuss a humanitarian perspective on international security, it comes with an odd flavor when the president of ICRC speaks on such an issue. Representing an organization rooted in the jus in bello of the Geneva Conventions, the ICRC is the living proof of the international community's failure to establish a functioning security system. At the same time, the ICRC has been particularly close to the transformation of conflict dynamics and security challenges over the decades, and all the important developments in our humanitarian world, and thus of the jus in bello framework, have happened as a reaction to the transformation of battlefields, weapons, arms bearers, and victims in armed conflict, which are at the same time critical reference points for any credible security system. The question, therefore, is today, are we confronted with just a temporary deterioration of our environment, or are we experiencing yet again a much more fundamental transformation of warfare and of the security environment overall? And can thus a humanitarian perspective to international security offer insights into some broader challenges to which the security community that you represent has to deal with thoroughly? Before responding, let me just take a couple of step backs and to explain a little bit more from where I'm coming in my argument. When you work at the ICRC, be it as a delegate in the field, as a head of operations, or as the president for the matter, your first thought will likely be about security. Our institutional genetics are defined by the fact that we provide security to people in some of the worst circumstances, and at the same time we need security in order to deliver on our mandate to assist and protect those not participating in hostilities. Our first concern is the well-being of people who suffer from the violence and conflicts around them. To be able to help them, we take precautions to ensure the maximum safety and security of our staff. We do so through a decentralized approach to security based on risk prevention, risk reduction, limited risk-taking. In turn, our operations create security for beneficiaries and staff through the focus on acceptance, transparency, and a panoply of assistance and protection activities for which my organization stands. I believe that creating such a minimal space for humanity in the midst of conflict must also be the starting point of any serious and comprehensive security system. It is undeniable reality today that we are exposed to the rapidly deteriorating safety and security patterns in many of the conflicts in which we are operating. We see more, longer, more protracted, and deeper conflicts, often exacerbated by natural disasters. Look at Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, and many more. We see a growing number of regionalized conflicts, which question the ability of national delivery systems to respond to the essential needs of communities for water, food, housing, health, and education. We see an implosion of public services for which the Syrian crisis has been the most telling example, but by far not the only one. We see fragmented powers which themselves have increasing difficulties to navigate the destructured conflicts with an ever-growing number of arms bearers and authorities, and which can be an obstacle to access civilian populations. We see warfare moving from open battlefields into city centers, threatening more people and making the distinction between combatants and civilians increasingly difficult. We see new forms of warfare and weapons with a heavier impact for civilians and insufficient clarity on some of the fundamental provisions of international humanitarian law. We see broad disregard of IHL, of international humanitarian law and human rights law by both states and non-state actors. And finally, we see all this translated in record numbers of population displacements, the highest since World War II, refugee and IDPs. Explanations for this deterioration are multiple. They range from the lack of consensus on collective security objectives amongst powers at regional and global level, to the disempowerment of international institutions driven by national antagonisms, from the lack of trust on the viability of traditional peace and security mechanisms to the lack of broadly accepted leadership role in the international system. For us as humanitarians, the current international system leads first and foremost to a more contested humanitarian space. For the difficulty to find political solutions to such a deteriorating environment, political and security actors have discovered humanitarian action as a low-hanging fruit to advance broader and more transformatory goals like human rights, rule of law, democracy, peace and security. Expanding humanitarian agendas and activities are somehow replacing diplomatic and political action to build a more durable international security system today. Those who have heard me speak in other occasions know that as humanitarian actors, we are highly uncomfortable with such a situation, which we experience as a politicization of the humanitarian space and as a deep contradiction to the broad political acknowledgement that humanitarian action cannot solve political problems. For safe and secure humanitarian action, we rely on a true and tested consensus-based approach, on proximity and engagement with all weapons bearers, on self-limitation to what action compatible with the principles of neutrality, impartiality and independence, and thus to an approach in diametrical opposition to the power or force-based approach of other actors. The seemingly trendy integration of peace, security, human rights, and humanitarian objectives is in a contradiction to the distinct, neutral, impartial, and independent approach, with potentially disastrous effects for the perception and acceptance of humanitarian actors on the ground. At the same time, we are amongst the first ones to acknowledge and to recognize on the basis of our direct experience today that we are facing a new and mutating conflict type, and that therefore some of the previous assumptions guiding our action may have to be thoroughly and carefully revisited. The ICRC is no longer operating only in a model of political conflicts derived from the use of military force between autonomous political actors as a mean of projecting power over another in a delineated context with a particular political end goal. While this Clausewitz model still explains the dynamic of some of the traditional battlefields in which ICRC operates, maybe it explains Ukraine, maybe it explains Colombia, ICRC's original approach is increasingly challenged by the occurrence of conflicts with distinct features from the traditional model, such as in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya, or Lake Chad. In these new contexts, parties are no longer construed or understood strictly as autonomous political organizations confronting each other over ideology, territory, or resources. On the contrary, parties' mutated conflicts tend to fragment and transform as the conflict evolves. While contexts matter in terms of military and political symbols over which parties attempt to exercise some kind of control, yes, it matters whether you control parts of Yemen, Anbar province, Somalia, or Libya, the ideological or military demonstration of power seems to matter much more than the actual tactical impact of military operation towards a particular end goal. Look at the Shabab attacks on Kenyan students, the kidnapping of Yazidi or Nigerian civilian. What would the military rationale of all this be? As conflicts become protracted and parties tend to fragment, we observe a growing confusion on the political end goals of those conflicts. The lack of political end goal in turn hinders regional and international mediation efforts and the perspective of stability in the affected regions. The connections allegedly or actual between the parties through military and political alliances are becoming key vectors of conflict dynamics, involving the movement of both resources and fighters across conflict zones. Taliban, ISIS, foreign fighters operating in Afghanistan pitched against NATO-sponsored and supported Afghan forces. While the context remains paramount in the day-to-day conduct of hostilities, loose connections between the parties dictate strategic choices, with some similarities with the Cold War time, but in a much more loose way. The allegiance of Boko Haram to Islamic State group would be an illustration in point. The display of merciless and indiscriminate violence plays an important part in this demonstration of power, since these actors are purposefully dissociating themselves from previous regimes or the maintenance of any particular universal order, but rather are aimed at the destruction of accepted legal, social, and cultural norms in a particular context. The role of social media, and through it to the traditional media, is paramount as a vehicle to disseminate this demonstration of power and determination of the parties as an end goal of the military operation. In other words, one could argue that some of the most challenging environments confronting the ICRC today are not simply the results of the deterioration of the traditional Clausewitz-type environments getting more violent and complex, but rather mutated forms of specific conflict environments. The ICRC has been confronted by similar shifts in conflict environments across its history. They often relate to the change of generation of means and methods of warfare. These shifts have called for significant adjustments in protection strategies, both in terms of vulnerable groups targeted by the ICRC and in terms of means of engagement. Since there seemed to be no clear end goal in these mutating conflicts, the ICRC needs to operate in such contexts of unclarity for an extended period of time, which again has an impact upon the mobilization of resources and the planning of our operations. Since mutating conflicts are driven by the demonstration of cold-blooded determination and brutal provocations, the ICRC needs to operate increasingly in the intricacies of these conflicts, in close connection with civil society groups such as the National Societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent, local NGOs, and like-minded partners like Doctors Without Borders. Its legitimacy can no longer just rest on ensuring respect for the universal rules of IHL, as such because such universality is fundamentally questioned by the new actors, but on its ability to build and maintain relationships with all parties in all circumstances, animated by a pragmatist sense of humanity, not compromising on core values, but not pushing for any sort of politicized accountability or governance regime. The ICRC further maintains its efforts to build relationship with parties and institutions at the local, regional, and international level specific to a particular conflict as a mean to create a network of positive interlocutors needed to sustain these pragmatic operations and minimal humanitarianism over the long run in a completely changed environment. In our multipolar world with multi-layered conflicts and a multitude of actors and approaches to the creation and safeguarding of security, humanitarian aid depends on the overarching consensus that a humanitarian space, separate from political power competition, can and must exist. The humanitarian perspective on security is hence multidimensional. We seek proximity to all the relevant actors, acceptance by the authorities, respect for international humanitarian law by states, and understanding of our mission and means by all for a secure and safe humanitarian space, even in the midst of conflict and violence. I thank you.